It's the Get Published radio show. And here's your host, Gerald Everett Jones, the guy who has the answers because, well, he's made all the mistakes himself.
On today's show, our topic is dystopian and post-apocalyptic books. So whether you think the world will end soon or you're sure the wrong guys are in charge, buckle up for a rocky ride.
It's amazing how doom and gloom always gets an audience. I know I'm a huge fan.
It's stunning to realize I have lived so long that 1984 and 2001 are distant memories and not futuristic fiction.
You know, I think these genres cater to our worst fears, but I also think there's the notion that bad as it ever gets, humans will survive and maybe even prosper. Well, first off, Let's agree or disagree on some definitions, and I'm not clear myself. What is dystopian, Cheyenne?
Well, dystopian would describe any sort of unpleasant, imagined, maybe futuristic, in some cases, state where typically a totalitarian government is kind of the main ruling class.
Or there's no government.
Or occasionally no government. Sometimes dystopian can refer to like an environmentally degraded state as well.
Oh, yes, the devastated landscape.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that ties into post-apocalyptic because sometimes the landscape is devastated because of some apocalyptic event. Tom, What would you say about post-apocalyptic?
Well, first of all, it's more fun than dystopian.
I don't know about that.
Because it means aliens or
if you like to camp out, it is.
Or we've all had to pack up and move to Mars. All kinds of stuff you can do with post-apocalyptic. Dystopian, to me, the most interesting thing about it is that none of this has come to pass. And this is a lot of the people who wrote this
now wait.
stuff.
You don't think that the newspeak in 1984 isn't being practiced on a daily basis?
Well, I don't think it's 1984 or anything like it. You can speak all kinds of stuff. Each generation that comes in speaks.
Oh, yes. Stay tuned for our episode on First Amendment. You'll enjoy it.
I mean, like, everybody has their own phrases. I remember in the 60s, if you were cool, you would say cool things. And cool cools off real fast.
And that was supposed to be Marshall McLuhan, right?
Yeah.
The medium is the message.
And he still exists, but I don't think his stuff has quite come off. I think it was true, though, for a bit of the 70s. You could say he hit it on the mark. When I like your idea. TV, just to look at TV.
I like your idea that as gloomy and as dysfunctional, if you will, these worlds may be painted. They are evidence that we are self-criticizing, say, self-analytical as a society, that we're trying to look at what lessons might be learned. There's the whole thing with the Titanic. Actually, people know it more as the movie. But, the Titanic was technology, the epitome of technology, the ship that could not sink. And, of course, it sinks. And the lesson of the movie is that their love survives no matter what. Okay, and so there's this hopefulness that one of the things about human beings, of course, the Darwinian, if you will, not to get too political, but science political, but Darwinian in that humans, the unique thing about our species is that we survive by adapting. We are the most adaptable. Well, actually, Tom would probably have
the most adaptable.
Let me refer briefly to the Titanic. Every generation has their own saying about that. When the ship went down, it was called the ship that God himself couldn't sink. Everybody said
that was a challenge.
That was why it sank, because they went without God. I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
Then it was because of the arrogance of technology. And then it was just, it's a lousy, rotten, horrible world, and ships sink and people go down with them. And that's sort of like no reason, just bad things happen. You can redo that. Every generation will redo that. But dystopian is written out of fear. Very bright writers, seeing, frightened of what it is, and then they predict ahead what's going to happen. And the most interesting thing to me, it never happened.
I've always seen it as something that's, like you said, very predictive. And I think it goes back to like what you were saying about how the message of the movie, The Titanic, is like their love survives. I think we try to find some sort of truth intermingled with like the light and hope in dark times of oppression. And that's sort of the purpose that the dystopian novels serve. In a way, one of the purposes is to kind of give us a sort of uplifting feeling, but then also a little bit of fear and anxiety about what could possibly happen.
There's definitely a warning flag there in a lot of it. And I'm thinking about one particular exception to what Tom is saying about things not working out. Sinclair Lewis, 1935, It Can't Happen Here. That was at the really... Hitler was just ascending to power in Germany, and in fact, a lot of Germans and German Americans, including my grandmother, thought, he was a good thing for America, and it wasn't until, for Germany, for putting them back on track, because the economy was abysmal there. It was 1,000,000 marks to buy a loaf of bread. It wasn't until later that his abuses became publicized that a lot of people turned against him.
Right,
and Sinclair Lewis, this was a very distant early warning in 1935 that this was a bad guy and that this was going to be bad things.
And the parallels that you see between It Can't Happen Here and kind of our current political climate are astonishing, because It Can't Happen Here really focuses on terror executed under the guise of patriotism and traditional values.
Yeah. Well, Sinclair Lewis was attacking Huey Long, is specifically what he was doing, and he was wrong about that.
Yeah.
There's a rethinking of Huey Long's life written by a man who interviewed only the people who knew him personally before he died, and it absolutely reverses topsy-turvy.
Well, they did that
what
movie
Huey
with
Long
Sean
really
Penn.
was about.
Like he was some big hero. He was an innovator. It was the fact that the environment that he was in was so corrupt that he just simply used it against itself.
Absolutely, and he did become a complete, total dictator in Louisiana, but what he was working against was one of the most horrible societies ever devised, and that would have been a great dystopian society if anybody had seen what was really going on down there.
Well, the Man in the High Castle, that sent a chill up and down my spine, I will say.
Yeah, that one, I think it's so interesting, too. I always loved the little detail of having the characters in a book that's describing, if the non-Allied forces had won, that they're reading a book where the Allied forces
Let's talk about those consequences. Let's talk about those consequences right after the break, because I think that particular book, especially because it's running in cable series now, it's kind of been resurrected, and I understand *Handmaid's Tale* also going to be a cable series. So when we're back from the break, let's talk a little bit more about what the specific world that's described in The Man in the High Castle.
Get Published Radio will be right back after this message. GetPublishedRadio.com is your portal to a wealth of resources for realizing your fondest dreams of self-expression. On our For Authors pages, you'll find a directory of editors and support services. You'll also find links just for publishers and for promoters. And if you want our help with any part of it, you'll find a Request for Services form. It's all there. What are you waiting for? At GetPublishedRadio.com. Welcome back as Gerald, Cheyenne, and Tom continue their discussion of dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction.
Okay, before the break, we were talking about dystopian fiction, in particular, The Man in the High Castle. That's Philip K. Dick, 1962. And I wanted to just set the stage for those who haven't read the book or seen the cable series. The premise of the book is that the Germans won the race for the atom bomb, and they nuked Washington, D.C., and America surrendered. And so what happens is the Hitler, the Third Reich, rules the eastern part of the United States up to the Rocky Mountains, and then Japan rules the west coast, again, up to the Rocky Mountains. And one of the interesting dynamics of it is that the Germans now turn against the Japanese and the Japanese against the Germans, just as the Allies, the Americans and the Russians, turned against each other after World War II. So, you guys, what do you think of that situation? Certainly it's not what happened, but it's interesting how it played out, Mr. Page.
Well, I found it hard to believe. That was my my problem with Philip Dick, he has great ideas, and then he writes stories around the great ideas, and they're great melodramatic ideas. You try to place them in reality, and for me, it's a very, very hard thing to do that, to make it convincing enough to keep me reading. He's a great writer. This one, I have to snivel and whine and whimper my way out of. I just did not enjoy the book as much as I hoped I would. Plus, there was something that was kind of understated, and that was that both Japan and Germany were very close allies in mentality when it came to race. They were both believers in racial purity and in practicing pure racial things. That they had in common.
Just with different races.
Just with different races, yeah. But even so...
Which can cause some issues.
Yeah. But even so, that the book didn't quite get to me as much as I hoped it would.
The protagonists in that book are insurgent. And, you would think that it might create a level of identification with, well, for example, if you were an insurgent in Syria and you were not a member of ISIS, but you were anti-Assad, you would have what I think in the United States we would consider to be a relatively righteous cause. Okay?
Right.
And the impossibility of, look at the power of the usurpers. Yeah. And, that's fearsome. You actually made the point, Tom, about War of the Worlds and about H.G. Wells, thinking of the Martians as the imperialistic British invaders.
Exactly.
And so that's some of the tone here. In the United States, we haven't really known what it was like to be under somebody's boot.
Yeah, we didn't stay very long.
And indeed, we've got a couple of generations that for whom even World War II is just something in the history books.
Yeah. It seems very distant nowadays. We've become very detached from that issue, it seems like. And a lot of history classes, you don't even get to World War II. You kind of cover everything up to that point, and then the class is over. So I feel like it wasn't really covered as thoroughly as it should be.
Well, and Cheyenne, you were remarking about Plot Against America. Of course, there's that. Yeah. That's probably more about racism with Jewish population in Brooklyn than it really is about Lindbergh's becoming president.
Yeah, it focuses very heavily on anti-Semitism and kind of repercussions that would have in America, just how it would have changed the whole landscape during that time if we had had an anti-Semitic president in office during World War II.
Well, I felt in that book it was more like Roth wanting to write a family saga, not unlike other books that he had done, and the wrapper, the excuse for the book was this Nazi takeover of the United States. But in fact, I really didn't find as much of the political machinations as just more the, what would I say, emotional and family issues?
A lot of people tried to draw the conclusion that he was kind of setting up an allegorical tale relating to the Bush presidency at the time.
Really?
He denies that. That was one inference that some people got from the Plot Against America.
The New Yorker published a fascinating article to me about this generation of Germans is finally looking at the Holocaust and what happened. I was married to a German lady for many years, and she said in public education, history stopped at 1918, and they just didn't go there.
Really?
And she passed away in 2011, God bless her. But before she died, the year before she died, she made a concentrated, focused effort to find out what was going on, especially about the von Stauffenberg plot. Because what drove her crazy was why didn't somebody...
That was a plot to kill Hitler, right?
Yeah, why didn't somebody get this guy when they knew what was happening, especially these brave generals who were supposedly working for the nation? And that
they did try at least a few times.
That is apparently being shared by the German population now. The children of and grandchildren of my wife's generation, they are looking at it very seriously. And one of the things that they will admit is people did sense that something horrible was going on, but the Gestapo really had, the Black SS really had control of the population, and you didn't talk about it because they would hear about it.
Well, and I think in Germany today, freedom of speech is very, very highly valued in some ways.
Absolutely.
In some ways, from what you read about it, and I have not traveled extensively in Germany. I've set foot in an airport a couple of times, but I think what's written about it, at least in the Western press, is that it's a very idealistic
this generation.
Political environment.
But Monica's family, all the Germans from that era, they lived in fear. That was the main thing. They were living in fear. They were far more afraid of the Gestapo and the Russians. They were not afraid. They loved the American. Patton came in. He was a hero. He rescued them from the SS, and Patton sent his officers out to denazify Munich. And one of those people was Chief Parker.
There was the Marshall Plan. Mm-hmm. There was the Marshall Plan. Well, listen, when we come back from the break, what I'd like to do is I'd like to drill into The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, because not only because there's going to be a cable series, or I guess there is a cable series, but also because of it's as much a political inversion of things as it is science fiction. I mean, you set something in the future, and you've got to kind of make up some technology to go with it. So when we get back to the break, yes, let's talk about The Handmaid's Tale. You know, in all the history of the world, with today's technology, it's never been easier to get published, to self-publish your printed book, ebook, audiobook, even multimedia ebook. And not just novels and memoirs, or how-to books and histories, although if that's what you've got, let's have it. But also poetry, spoken word, graphic novel, cartoons, children's picture book, interactive video, games, virtual reality, and imaginative mashups of all this stuff. Get into the game. Along the way, you'll no doubt need some professional help from an editor, a book designer, a publicist. But isn't the investment in yourself worth it? How about you take the money you'd spend on your next vacation and get famous instead? GetPublishedRadio.com. That's our support website where we've got links to all the resources you'll need. And don't forget that request for services form if you crave some personal attention. That's GetPublishedRadio.com. Hey, it's all about the First Amendment. You can use it or lose it.
You know, Runke Productions, the audio magicians, can take your radio shows, podcasts, audiobooks, and ads from the streets of New York to the outer reaches of the galaxy.
I think we need more echo at the end of that.
Now look, visit us at runkeeproductions.com.
I still think we need more cowbell.
Welcome back as Gerald, Cheyenne, and Tom continue their discussion of dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction.
We've been talking about dystopian fiction and also post-apocalyptic fiction. Easy for you to say. I wanted to, now that we're coming back off the break, I wanted to talk about The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood. That was 1965, is it? 1985. Okay. At which really the world is involved in religious wars. Actually, the political order has devolved into feudal states where there's lords that are each commanding their private armies, and each one of them is a different flavor of, actually it's Christian religion, I believe, where they're fighting each other. And Cheyenne, it seems far-fetched, and yet there's a creepiness that seems very familiar about it.
Yeah, so basically kind of a result of all the wars and the environmental degradation that's happened in this society has rendered a large chunk of the population infertile. So there's only so many women that can still reproduce, and they're assigned to these commanders, essentially, to be their handmaids. And the whole decline of this particular society, in a way, I think, is blamed on women. They're kind of seen as the reason for, smut like porn and prostitution and violence. And
I didn't pick that up when I read it.
That's the feeling I always got when I read it. I mean, it just, women are seen to make babies and kind of stay out of the way. And that's where they want them to be. So they're kind of stripped of all of their rights and responsibilities and just put into this very singular role.
That has historical precedent, that kind of thinking, although it wasn't carried as far, say, in Christendom as it was in that story. But there was a very definite bias against women. It's tricky to say this, but obviously in one of the main religions, there's a very strong thing of placing women in their place and what their role is. Much of that disappeared with the Reformation. But during the period when there was this very, what you call a religious empire, it definitely worked against women, and that is actually kind of the subject of something that a little later in we'll get into with my take. But
Go ahead. We don't have too much time.
It's called the Courtly Love Tradition, and it was a tradition, and it's going to be one of my segments, a tradition that was
one of
launched.
your essays. Yes.
One of my essays. Did I say one of my traditions? Oh, my God.
Your essays have become an honored tradition on Get Published Radio.
It was here before I was, folks. But what's interesting about it was launched by women, in particular Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's quite a fascinating event in history. But The Handmaid's Tale, that does have certain historical resonance with me.
Well,
others,
it's an alternative future. But spoiler alert here, okay, and I don't know to what extent this will be brought out in the screen version, but the thing that really stunned me was you get to the end of this book, there another 100 years in the future, or maybe it's 200 years in the future, there's a bunch of historians getting together, and they're comparing the history that we've lived through to the Handmaid's Tale era history. And they don't find a nickel's worth of difference between them in terms of morality, in that the humans do whatever is necessary to do to adapt to the environment. And so, as you said, Cheyenne, you have this population problem. Now we're faced with the whole population explosion challenge. Actually, it's an even more existential threat than climate, because if we outgrow our food supply, it won't really make a difference what happens to the planet, because the humans will have extinguished themselves.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually kind of behind Inferno, which was talking about Dan Brown, the population explosion, which was a big. Again, I think it's almost like we're having the conversation about climate because we don't think we can do anything about population.
Well, yeah, it seems that way, and it seems like population is a much easier thing to control than going through and trying to...
Well, good luck.
But that's the problem. People don't want to control it. They think we still have this kind of outdated idea that we need to reproduce.
Okay, outdated ideas.
And that
we're going to have to continue this on a future episode. We've only scratched the surface. Dystopian and post-apocalypse. Hopefully it won't happen before we're back on the air again. Thanks so much. And that's our show. Get Published is all about self-publishing and self-expression, and that getting published and the ease of getting published these days is really all about exercising the First Amendment in this free society of ours. What we need these days are more ideas. Even though we're deluged with information, we need more good ideas. And we need debate about those ideas. Book-length debate, not just snippets that are posted on social media, not just selfies and cute pictures of your pets, the things that you really think. And remember, because in self-publishing there are no gatekeepers out there, that is the good news and that is the bad news. So hire some good help. Perhaps you found that here. You may find it on the website, whatever you're looking for, whether it's an editor or a book designer or somebody help you promote. But hire good help, get good advice, and by all means, please get published.
The Get Published radio show with Gerald Everett Jones is produced by Runkey Productions. Our producer is Lori Marple, and your announcer is Bill Navarro. Music by Jason Shaw. You'll find links to support services on our website, getpublishedradio.com. So whether you're an author, a publisher, or a self-promoter, get help at getpublishedradio.com. And thanks for listening.